Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most glittering traps in history, the Byzantine Imperial Palace. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're a young noblewoman in the Byzantine Empire, enjoying a relatively peaceful life. You worry about family obligations. You worry about marriage prospects. You worry about whether your mother approves of your embroidery. Normal concerns. Then one day, someone arrives with astonishing news. The emperor might be looking for a wife. And somehow, your name has appeared on the list. Congratulations. You have just become a contestant in what may be history's most stressful lottery. At first, this sounds wonderful. After all, who wouldn't want to become Empress? You would live in Constantinople, the greatest city in medieval Europe. Its massive walls protected hundreds of thousands of people. Its markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. Its churches glittered with gold mosaics that made visitors wonder whether they had accidentally wandered into heaven. And at the centre of it all stood the imperial palace. If everything went well, you might live there. If everything went poorly, you might also live there. That was part of the problem. From a distance, becoming Empress looked like a fairy tale. Silk dresses, jewelled crowns, banquets, servants, magnificent ceremonies. Up close, it looked more like accepting a job where every co-worker might secretly be plotting against you. The Byzantine Empire inherited the traditions of ancient Rome, and its rulers took ceremony very seriously. The emperor was considered God's chosen ruler on earth. As his wife, you would become the most important woman in the empire. That sounds impressive until you realize that every important person in the empire suddenly develops a keen interest in your business. Nobles watch you. Priests watch you. Foreign ambassadors watch you. Members of your husband's family watch you. Servants watch you. At some point, even the palace cat probably has political opinions about you. Nothing you do escapes attention. Wear the wrong clothing and people talk. Support the wrong court faction and people talk. Fail to produce an heir and people talk. Produce an heir and people talk even more. The ideal Byzantine empress was expected to be beautiful, intelligent, humble, pious, charitable, politically useful, endlessly patient, and capable of navigating one of the most complicated courts in world history. In other words, the empire was searching for a woman who did not actually exist, and the pressure never stopped. You were expected to smile during ceremonies that lasted for hours. You were expected to remember complicated court etiquette. You were expected to support your husband publicly, even when he was making decisions that seemed determined to create fresh disasters. Which, to be fair, some emperors treated almost like a hobby. The most dangerous part was that success often attracted enemies. The more influence you gained, the more people wanted to undermine you. The more popular you became, the more rivals you created. And the more power you accumulated, the more dangerous your position became. The crown glittered beautifully beneath the palace lights, but hidden among the pearls and gold was an uncomfortable truth. In Byzantium, becoming empress was not the happy ending. It was the beginning of the problem. Now that you've discovered becoming empress is far less glamorous than advertised, you still have one major obstacle ahead of you: actually becoming empress. And in Byzantium, that process could be surprisingly strange. Imagine receiving an imperial summons ordering you to travel to Constantinople. Nobody tells you exactly why. Your family suddenly becomes excited. Your mother starts inspecting your wardrobe. Your father begins acting unusually polite. Relatives you've never met suddenly appear and offer advice. This is generally a bad sign. Before long you learn the truth. The emperor needs a wife, and you are one of the candidates. Welcome to the Byzantine bride show. Yes, this was a real thing. Several emperors selected wives through elaborate competitions that gathered unmarried noblewomen from across the empire. Officials would evaluate candidates and determine who possessed the qualities necessary to become empress. In theory, this allowed the emperor to choose the most suitable bride. In practice, it must have felt like participating in the world's most intimidating job interview. The stakes were slightly higher than most interviews, however. If you failed, you went home. If you succeeded, you became one of the most powerful women on earth. No pressure. The exact details varied from case to case, and historians still debate how some of these bride shows operated. But surviving accounts suggest that beauty, family background, intelligence, manners, and political usefulness all played important roles. You couldn't simply look impressive. You had to look impressive while representing a family that wouldn't create future headaches for the emperor. Unfortunately, nearly every noble family specialized in creating future headaches. The most famous example involved the future Empress Theodora, although her path to power was far more unusual than most. Others came from respected aristocratic families and entered palace life through more traditional routes. Regardless of background, every woman faced the same reality. The moment you entered the imperial court, your life stopped belonging entirely to you. Marriage was no longer a personal matter, it was state business. Your future children might become emperors. Your relatives might gain influence. Your friendships might affect policy. Even your personality could have political consequences. Imagine being judged not only on whether people liked you, but on whether your grandchildren might someday start a civil war. That was essentially the level of planning involved. And if you were chosen, your reward was immediate entry into a world of unimaginable wealth, a world filled with silk, gold, power, and prestige. Unfortunately, it was also filled with ambitious courtiers who had been playing palace politics long before you arrived. And unlike you, they already knew all the rules. At last, you've been chosen. Out of all the candidates, the emperor has selected you. The ceremonies are completed. The marriage has taken place. Crowds cheer as you appear in public wearing magnificent silk robes embroidered with gold thread. For a brief moment, everything feels like a dream. Then you move into the great palace of Constantinople, and the dream becomes considerably more complicated. The great palace was not simply a palace. It was practically a city hidden inside another city. Built over centuries, it stretched across enormous sections of Constantinople, overlooking the Sea of Marmara. It contained reception halls, chapels, gardens, courtyards, private apartments, audience chambers, libraries, workshops, barracks, and enough corridors to confuse even people who worked there. You could probably get lost walking to breakfast. In fact, you might get lost several times before lunch. Every room seemed designed to impress. Walls shimmered with mosaics made from gold and coloured glass. Marble columns arrived from distant provinces. Massive chandeliers reflected light across polished floors. Foreign visitors often described the palace with a sense of disbelief. The empire wanted ambassadors to feel overwhelmed, and it worked. But while visitors saw splendour, you quickly discover something else. The palace is full of people, an incredible number of people. Servants, officials, guards, secretaries, priests, eunuchs, nobles, messengers, attendants, relatives, more relatives, and several people whose purpose seems to be standing in hallways looking important. The palace never truly sleeps. Someone is always moving through its corridors. Someone is always carrying information. And someone is almost certainly discussing you. As Empress, your daily life becomes surprisingly public. You cannot simply wander wherever you want. You cannot always speak freely. You cannot assume conversations remain private. Every appearance is carefully planned. Every ceremony follows strict rules. Even where you stand during official events carries symbolic meaning. The Byzantine court loved ceremony the way some people love their favourite sports team, except the rules were far more complicated. One mistake could cause embarrassment. Several mistakes could create political problems. And political problems in Byzantium had a tendency to grow into disasters. The greatest challenge, however, is learning whom to trust. Everyone smiles, everyone bows, everyone praises your wisdom. This sounds pleasant until you realise they may be doing exactly the same thing for your rivals. The palace is filled with competing factions, ambitious families, and individuals hoping to gain influence through proximity to power. You have entered a world where friendships are valuable, loyalty is uncertain, and gossip travels faster than imperial messengers. The golden ceilings remain beautiful. The gardens remain peaceful. The luxury remains extraordinary. But as you settle into your new home, an uncomfortable realization begins to form. You are no longer merely living in the palace. You are living inside the center of the empire's political battlefield. And before long, another challenge will arrive. Everyone will begin asking the same question. When will there be an heir? No sooner have you learned your way around the great palace than a new responsibility arrives. Actually, responsibility is the wrong word. Expectation is more accurate. Pressure is even more accurate. The entire empire now wants you to have a son. Not eventually. Not when you're ready. As soon as possible. For a Byzantine empress, producing an heir was one of the most important duties attached to the crown. The empire needed stability. Stability required a clear line of succession. And a clear line of succession usually meant a healthy male heir. Simple enough in theory. History, unfortunately, rarely cooperated with theory. The moment your wedding celebrations end, people begin watching for signs of pregnancy. Courtiers speculate, relatives speculate, foreign ambassadors speculate. Even people you've never met seem eager to speculate. The future of the Roman Empire apparently depends upon your private life. No pressure. When an heir finally arrives, the celebrations can be enormous. Church bells ring, public ceremonies are organized, gifts flow through the palace. Citizens rejoice because the future appears secure. For about 5 minutes, then people begin worrying about the next problem, because one son might die young. Several sons might compete against one another. Brothers might become rivals. Uncles might challenge nephews. Generals might decide they would make excellent emperors. Byzantine history contains enough succession crises to fill an entire library. Sometimes having an heir solved problems. Sometimes it created entirely new ones. As Empress, your position often depended heavily on your children. A successful mother of future emperors could gain enormous influence. She might act as regent. She might guide policy. She might become one of the most powerful individuals in the empire. But if your children lost favour, your fortunes could change quickly. Very quickly. The Byzantine court had an unfortunate habit of treating political success as temporary. One year you might be celebrated throughout Constantinople. A few years later, you could find yourself isolated because a rival faction gained the emperor's ear. Some empresses mastered these dangers brilliantly, others did not. Meanwhile, your daily life continues beneath constant observation. Every public appearance is analysed, every rumour is discussed, Every interaction with powerful officials becomes potential political news. You begin to realize that being Empress is less like living in a palace and more like performing on a stage where the audience never leaves. And if producing heirs creates pressure, it is nothing compared to the next challenge awaiting you, because the palace contains something far more dangerous than succession problems. Other ambitious people. By the time you've adjusted to palace life, learned dozens of ceremonial rules, and survived endless questions about heirs, you might think the worst is over. Unfortunately, Byzantium has a surprise for you. Several surprises, actually. Most of them are disguised as friendly people. The great palace is filled with rivals. Some are obvious. Most are not. The dangerous ones rarely announce themselves. Nobody walks up and says, "Good morning, Your Majesty. I intend to destroy your influence and replace your supporters within 6 months." That would at least be honest. Instead, palace politics operates through whispers, alliances, favours, and carefully timed gossip. Everyone smiles, everyone bows, everyone claims loyalty, and everyone seems to be discussing everyone else. As Empress, you quickly discover that every powerful family in Constantinople wants something. Some want prestigious positions, some want military commands, some want tax exemptions, some simply want access to the emperor. You become valuable because you can help provide that access. Suddenly people are bringing gifts, offering compliments, praising your wisdom, laughing a little too hard at jokes that are not particularly funny. If someone tells you that you possess the greatest political insight in the empire after meeting you for 3 minutes, caution is advised. They probably want something. One of the most influential groups within the palace consisted of the eunuchs. These officials often occupied key administrative positions and controlled access to important information. Many became trusted advisors, diplomats, and palace managers. Wise empresses learned quickly that understanding palace networks could be just as important as understanding government, because information was power, and power attracted competition. The situation became even more complicated when members of the emperor's own family entered the picture. Mothers, brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts. The Byzantine imperial family occasionally resembled a collection of rival kingdoms forced to share the same dining table. Family dinners must have been fascinating. And by fascinating we mean terrifying. History offers countless examples of relatives plotting against one another in pursuit of influence. An ambitious brother might view an heir as an obstacle. A powerful mother-in-law might resent an empress's growing authority. A cousin might believe the throne should belong to him instead. The possibilities were endless. So were the conspiracies. The difficult truth was that popularity could become dangerous. The more influence you gained, the more attention you attracted. The more attention you attracted, the more enemies appeared. And in Constantinople, enemies did not always attack openly. Sometimes they spread rumours. Sometimes they built alliances. Sometimes they simply waited. As you settle deeper into palace life, one lesson becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest threats to an empress rarely came from foreign armies beyond the city walls. They usually came from people standing much, much closer. If palace rivalries are the hidden danger of being empress, ceremonies are the visible one. And there are a lot of ceremonies. An almost unbelievable number of ceremonies. The Byzantine Empire loved ritual with a level of enthusiasm normally reserved for sports fans discussing championship games. Every movement had meaning. Every garment had meaning. Every seat had meaning. Every doorway had meaning. At some point you begin to suspect that even the curtains have official ceremonial duties. As Empress, much of your life becomes a carefully choreographed performance. You attend religious festivals. You welcome foreign ambassadors. You participate in imperial processions. You appear at public celebrations. You accompany the emperor during important state occasions. And every one of these events follows rules that have been refined over centuries. Sometimes centuries of rules create a lot of rules. Visitors to Constantinople were often amazed by these spectacles. The imperial court seemed almost supernatural. Golden robes shimmered beneath candlelight. Choirs filled churches with music. Officials moved according to precise protocols. The emperor and empress appeared surrounded by an atmosphere of sacred authority. This was intentional. The empire wanted people to be impressed. It wanted ambassadors to return home, convinced they had witnessed the greatest court on earth. It wanted subjects to see stability, order, and divine favour. What it did not want was the empress tripping over her robes in front of a foreign delegation. Unfortunately, that possibility always existed. The clothing alone could be challenging. Imperial garments were magnificent, but hardly designed for comfort. Heavy silk, embroidered decorations, jewels, and ceremonial crowns could transform a simple public appearance into an endurance test. Looking majestic for several hours sounds wonderful. Actually doing it is another matter. Meanwhile, every gesture is being observed. Did you greet a certain noble first? Did you spend too much time speaking with a particular official? Did you appear distracted during a religious ceremony? People notice. And people talk. They always talk. Even your facial expressions can become subjects of discussion. A smile might be interpreted as support. A frown might be interpreted as disapproval. A moment of boredom might somehow become a political scandal by the end of the week. The pressure is exhausting, yet these ceremonies are not optional. They are essential to maintaining imperial authority. Every appearance reinforces the image of a powerful and stable empire, which means you must continue smiling, standing, bowing, praying, and processing through endless halls while remaining perfectly dignified. No matter how tired you feel, no matter how uncomfortable your crown becomes, and no matter how badly you want to sit down, because the moment you stop performing your role, people begin asking questions. And in Byzantium, questions had a dangerous habit of turning into rumours. That would soon become one of the greatest threats an empress could face. By now, you've learned how to survive ceremonies. You've learned how to navigate rivalries. You've learned that nearly everyone in the palace wants something. Unfortunately, there is one more lesson every Byzantine empress eventually discovers. Privacy is dead. Not mostly dead. Completely dead. The moment you become empress, your life ceases to belong entirely to you. Every action, every conversation, and every appearance becomes a matter of public interest. You are no longer just a person. You are an institution. And institutions do not get much alone time. The Great Palace may contain hundreds of rooms, but finding true privacy inside them is surprisingly difficult. Servants clean chambers, guards protect entrances, officials deliver messages, ladies in waiting accompany you throughout the day. Even when you are technically alone, you are rarely far from someone whose job involves observing you. Imagine trying to relax knowing that half the empire would love to know what you said during breakfast. That was essentially daily life. Foreign ambassadors reported on your behaviour. Court officials reported on your behaviour. Church leaders discussed your behaviour. And ordinary citizens sometimes discussed your behaviour too. The people of Constantinople loved imperial gossip. Loved it. News spread through the city with astonishing speed. A disagreement in the palace could become common knowledge before sunset. A rumour whispered in one corridor might reach the markets by the following morning. Modern social media would have felt strangely familiar, except the consequences were occasionally more severe. As Empress, your reputation becomes one of your most valuable possessions. If people view you as charitable, pious, and wise, your influence grows. If people view you as arrogant, wasteful, or manipulative, enemies gain opportunities. And enemies are always searching for opportunities. The problem is that reputation often has little to do with reality. A rumour does not need to be true. It simply needs to be believed. One misunderstood comment can become a scandal. One public disagreement can become evidence of a political feud. One unfortunate coincidence can become proof of an imaginary conspiracy. Byzantine society was deeply political, and information was a weapon. The people who controlled stories often controlled power. This forced empresses to think carefully about everything they did. Every public appearance mattered. Every friendship mattered. Every statement mattered. It sounds exhausting, because it was exhausting. And just when you think life could not become more stressful, another challenge emerges. Because in Byzantium, politics was not the only thing capable of dividing an empire. Religion could be even more dangerous. If you've managed to survive palace politics, endless ceremonies, and constant scrutiny, you might assume you're becoming good at this whole empress business. You would be mistaken, because now you've reached one of the most dangerous subjects in Byzantine life: religion. Modern people often think of religion as a personal matter. The Byzantines did not. For them, religion was tied directly to government, law, politics, military victories, natural disasters, and the survival of the empire itself. If a drought struck the countryside, people might wonder whether God was displeased. If an army suffered defeat, people might debate whether the empire had strayed from true doctrine. If an earthquake damaged Constantinople, theological arguments could suddenly become very urgent. And somehow, as empress, you could find yourself caught in the middle of all of it. This was particularly dangerous because Byzantine Christians frequently disagreed about theology. And when Byzantines disagreed about theology, they did so with remarkable enthusiasm. A debate over the nature of Christ could divide cities. Arguments over icons could divide families. Disputes between church leaders could shake the entire empire. Imagine an argument so intense that it threatens national stability. The Byzantines considered that a normal Tuesday. As empress, your personal beliefs mattered. A lot. Support the wrong bishop, and powerful enemies appear. Favour the wrong religious faction, and criticism spreads through the capital. Express the wrong opinion publicly, and suddenly half the empire is discussing your theology. Many empresses discovered this firsthand. Some became patrons of religious movements. Others influenced church policy. A few found themselves at the centre of controversies that lasted decades. One famous example involved the great iconoclast controversy, when the empire became deeply divided over the use of religious images. Emperors, bishops, monks, soldiers, and ordinary citizens argued passionately over the issue. Some empresses supported icons, others opposed them. Either choice guaranteed enemies. The difficult part was that there was rarely a safe position. Neutrality often looked like weakness. Choosing a side created opposition, and changing your mind created even more opposition. It was the political equivalent of trying to walk across a frozen lake, while everyone around you argued about which direction was safest. Eventually, something was going to crack. The pressure could be immense. You were expected to defend the faith, support the emperor, maintain public respect, and somehow avoid becoming the focus of a theological firestorm. If you've made it this far as a Byzantine empress, congratulations. You have survived court politics, you have survived religious controversies, you have survived rumours, you have survived ambitious relatives. Now comes the truly exciting part: people trying to overthrow the government. One of the unfortunate realities of Byzantine history is that the throne often looked easier to obtain from the outside than it actually was. This observation inspired countless individuals to try anyway. Generals tried, governors tried, relatives tried, former allies tried. Sometimes complete strangers looked at the emperor and thought, I could probably do that. History suggests they were often overconfident, yet that rarely stopped them. For an empress, a coup was among the most terrifying events imaginable because it threatened everything at once. Your position, your family, your children, your wealth, your future, your life. All could disappear in a matter of days, or hours, or occasionally before lunch. The most famous example came during the reign of Justinian I, in the year 632. The capital exploded into what became known as the Nika riots. What began as unrest between rival chariot racing factions quickly transformed into a full-scale rebellion. Large sections of Constantinople burned. Government buildings were destroyed. Thousands of angry citizens filled the streets. The rebels even proclaimed a new emperor. At one point, the situation became so desperate that Justinian reportedly considered fleeing the city, which would have been understandable. Most people tend to leave when surrounded by riots and revolutionaries. But according to later accounts, Empress Theodora refused. She delivered one of the most famous speeches in Byzantine history, declaring that royal purple made an excellent burial shroud. In simpler terms, she preferred dying as empress to living as a fugitive. Comforting words for everyone involved. Fortunately for Justinian, her determination helped convince the government to stay and fight. The rebellion was eventually crushed. The throne survived. And Theodora's reputation became legendary. Unfortunately, not every empress was so lucky. Many discovered that when a coup succeeded, the victors rarely left the previous ruling family in place. Former emperors were often imprisoned, exiled, blinded, or forced into monasteries. Their wives frequently shared the same fate. The Byzantine Empire had a remarkable talent for turning yesterday's rulers into today's prisoners. One week you could be presiding over imperial ceremonies beneath golden mosaics. The next week you might be packing for exile, assuming you were given time to pack. This uncertainty haunted palace life. Every rumour of rebellion created anxiety. Every military defeat raised questions. Every ambitious general became a potential threat. Because in Byzantium the throne was never completely secure, and sometimes the most dangerous enemy wasn't outside the palace. Sometimes he was already inside it. After surviving revolts, assassination plots, and political conspiracies, you might assume the greatest dangers in the Byzantine Empire involve armies. Armies are certainly dangerous. But armies have one major disadvantage. You can see them coming. Rumours are different. A rumour can enter the palace unnoticed, drift through a few conversations, pass between servants, officials and nobles, and before long, half of Constantinople believes something that never happened. And as Empress, rumours are one of your worst enemies, because no matter how powerful you become, you cannot arrest a whisper. The capital of Constantinople was one of the largest cities in the medieval world. Hundreds of thousands of people lived behind its famous walls. Merchants arrived from distant lands. Pilgrims filled the streets. Sailors crowded the harbours. And everyone loved gossip. The Byzantines may have built magnificent churches and preserved Roman civilization, but they also enjoyed discussing the private lives of important people with extraordinary enthusiasm, particularly yours. If you appeared too close to a certain nobleman during a ceremony, people talked. If you argued with a church leader, people talked. If you stayed out of public view for a few weeks, people talked. If you appeared in public every day, people still talked. It was an impressively efficient system. Sometimes rumours were harmless. Most were not. A false story could damage your reputation. It could weaken political alliances. It could encourage rivals. It could even convince powerful figures that the emperor's family was losing support. And in Byzantium, perception often mattered almost as much as reality. Perhaps people begin claiming that you are secretly controlling the emperor. Perhaps they claim you favour one religious faction over another. Perhaps they insist that your family is planning to seize more power. None of these stories need evidence. They simply need listeners. And there were always listeners. Some empresses became legendary targets of gossip. Theodora, despite her intelligence and influence, inspired countless stories from both supporters and enemies. Centuries later, historians still argue about which accounts are true, and which were little more than political attacks disguised as history. That tells you everything you need to know. If scholars cannot agree after 1,000 years, imagine how confusing things were at the time. The cruelest part is that defending yourself often made matters worse. Deny a rumour too strongly, and people become suspicious. Ignore it, and people assume it must be true. You are trapped. And while rumours could destroy reputations, the next danger was even worse. Because eventually, every Byzantine empress had to confront a terrifying possibility. What happens if you lose? Every Byzantine empress eventually lived with a quiet fear. Not the fear of invasion, not the fear of rebellion, not even the fear of assassination. The real fear was waking up one morning and discovering that your world had vanished overnight. Because in Byzantium, losing power rarely meant simply losing power. It meant losing everything. One day you might be seated beside the emperor beneath golden mosaics, while officials bowed before you. The next day, those same officials might be bowing before somebody else. Political fortunes changed with astonishing speed in Constantinople. A failed military campaign, a palace conspiracy, a disputed succession, an unpopular policy. Any one of these could bring down an emperor. And when emperors fell, empresses usually fell with them. The Byzantine solution to this problem was surprisingly consistent. Send them to a monastery. The empire had an almost magical ability to solve political disputes by forcing people to become monks or nuns. Former emperors became monks, princes became monks, rivals became monks, and empresses frequently became nuns. One begins to suspect the monasteries of Byzantium were filled with people who had other career plans. Officially, entering a monastery was a religious act. Unofficially, it was often a very convenient way to remove someone from politics. Once inside, your opportunities to lead armies, organize rebellions, or reclaim the throne became significantly limited. At least that was the theory. Reality was often more complicated. Some exiled empresses continued influencing politics through letters, allies and family connections. Others quietly accepted their fate and disappeared from public life. Many had little choice. Imagine spending years living in one of the most luxurious palaces on earth. You wear silk. You command servants. You participate in grand ceremonies. Then suddenly you find yourself in a modest monastery, following strict religious routines. The adjustment must have been dramatic, to put it mildly. And monasteries were not the only destination. Some empresses were sent into exile far from Constantinople. Others were confined to estates. A few were imprisoned. The lucky ones retained some comfort. The unlucky ones discovered how quickly former friends disappeared, because power attracts loyalty. Losing power reveals who was actually loyal. That lesson repeated itself throughout Byzantine history. The most tragic part was that many fallen empresses had done nothing wrong. They simply happened to be connected to the wrong emperor at the wrong time. When dynasties collapsed, innocence offered little protection. Political necessity usually mattered more. Yet despite these dangers, some remarkable women refused to accept defeat. Some fought their enemies. Some reclaimed power. And a few managed something even more extraordinary. They became stronger after losing everything. Not every Byzantine empress accepted defeat quietly. Some certainly did. Some entered monasteries, faded from public life, and spent their remaining years far from the centre of power. But others looked at exile, political rivals, military threats, and hostile court factions, and essentially said, no. These women became some of the most remarkable figures in Byzantine history, because surviving the Byzantine court required intelligence, thriving in it required courage, and fighting back after losing everything required something close to stubbornness on a legendary scale. Take Empress Irene, for example. Originally arriving in Constantinople as a young bride, she eventually became one of the most powerful rulers the empire had ever seen. After the death of her husband, Emperor Leo IV, she served as regent for her young son. Many people expected her influence to be temporary. Irene had other ideas. Over time, she maneuvered through court politics, neutralized rivals, and gradually consolidated power. Eventually, she became the sole ruler of the empire, not empress beside an emperor, not regent for an emperor, the ruler. In a world dominated by men, this was extraordinary. It was also controversial, very controversial. Her reign generated both admiration and criticism, but one thing was undeniable. Nobody could accuse Irene of being passive. Then there was Theodora, one of the most famous women in Byzantine history. After the death of her husband, Emperor Theophilos, she acted as regent for her son and helped restore the veneration of icons, ending one of the empire's most bitter religious disputes. For decades, emperors, bishops, soldiers and citizens had argued over religious images. The conflict divided the empire. Theodora helped bring it to an end. Not bad for someone living in a society that often expected women to remain in the background. Again and again, Byzantine history produced women who refused to accept the limitations others placed upon them. Some negotiated, some plotted, some built alliances, some outmaneuvered powerful generals and experienced politicians. A few even proved better rulers than the men around them, which must have been particularly irritating for those men. Of course, fighting back carried enormous risks. Failure could mean exile, imprisonment, or political destruction. Success created enemies, sometimes even more enemies than before. Yet these women continued anyway, because after years spent navigating palace intrigue, religious disputes, conspiracies, and constant scrutiny, many empresses learned a valuable lesson. In Byzantium, survival often belonged not to the strongest person, but to the most determined. And that raises the final question. After all the danger, stress, betrayals, and uncertainty, was being empress actually worth it at all? After everything you've endured, it is time to ask the obvious question. Was being a Byzantine empress actually worth it? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Of course it was. You lived in the richest city in Europe. You wore silk imported from distant lands. You attended ceremonies that dazzled foreign ambassadors. You had access to wealth that ordinary people could scarcely imagine. When you entered a room, nobles bowed. When you spoke, powerful men listened. When you travelled through Constantinople, crowds gathered to watch. That sounds like a remarkable life, and in many ways it was. The problem is that every privilege came attached to a cost. The palace was magnificent, but it was also a cage. The crown was beautiful. But it was also a burden. The influence was real. So were the dangers. While ordinary citizens worried about harvests, taxes, or local disputes, you worried about whether a military commander was planning a rebellion. While merchants worried about business, you worried about succession crises. While monks worried about their souls, you worried about political factions trying to destroy your reputation. Different problems. Not necessarily better ones. In fact, some days you might have looked at a fisherman working peacefully along the Bosporus and felt slightly jealous. At least nobody expected him to prevent a civil war before lunch. The greatest irony of all was that the women who seemed to possess everything often enjoyed the least security. A baker's wife might live a modest life, but she generally knew where she would sleep next month. An empress could not always say the same. One failed campaign, one palace conspiracy, one unpopular decision, one ambitious relative. That was sometimes all it took to bring an entire dynasty crashing down. And yet, despite the risks, many Byzantine empresses left an extraordinary legacy. They built churches, they sponsored charities, they influenced laws, they shaped religious policy, they guided emperors, some ruled empires, others saved them. Their achievements survived long after their enemies had vanished. Today, names like Theodora, Irene, Zoe, and Theodora the Younger remain famous because they were far more than decorative figures sitting beside a throne. They were political players in one of history's most complicated societies. So was being Empress worth it? Perhaps the answer depends on the person. If you enjoyed luxury, influence, prestige, and the chance to shape history, then maybe yes. If you preferred privacy, safety, peace of mind, and a reasonable work-life balance, then absolutely not. In the Byzantine Empire, becoming empress meant gaining the world. The challenge was keeping it. And more often than not, that proved to be the hardest part of all. And so, as our journey through the Byzantine palace comes to an end, you finally get to do something that many empresses desperately wish they could do. Take off the crown. Not because the ceremonies are over. Not because the empire is safe. But because carrying that crown every day was exhausting. Looking back, the life of a Byzantine empress was a strange contradiction. From the outside, it appeared to be the closest thing the medieval world had to a fairy tale. Gold-covered halls, silk robes, jewelled crowns, servants attending to every need, the admiration of millions, the power to influence the fate of an empire. It sounds wonderful, until you remember that fairy tales rarely include tax revolts, palace coups, theological controversies, and relatives plotting against each other at dinner. Byzantine empresses lived at the centre of one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. Constantinople stood as the greatest city in Europe for centuries. Its walls protected it from countless enemies. Its merchants connected continents. Its churches inspired awe throughout the Christian world. Yet the women at the top of this magnificent society often paid a heavy personal price. Many lost children. Many lost husbands. Many lost their freedom. Some lost everything. A few lost their lives. And all of them lived under pressures that would have broken most people. What makes these women remarkable is not simply that they survived. It is that many of them managed to leave their mark on history despite the obstacles surrounding them. Theodora helped save a dynasty during its darkest moment. Irene became ruler in her own right. Zoe repeatedly fought her way back into power despite attempts to remove her. Theodora the Younger helped reshape the religious future of the empire. Again and again, Byzantine empresses demonstrated intelligence, resilience, and determination. Sometimes they were heroes, sometimes they were villains. Often they were a complicated mixture of both. but they were never merely decorations beside the throne. They were active participants in the story of the empire. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The crown did not make these women powerful. Their ability to survive the crown did. So the next time you see a glittering mosaic of a Byzantine empress dressed in gold and pearls, remember that you are not simply looking at a symbol of wealth. You are looking at someone who spent every day navigating one of the most dangerous political environments in human history. Which is why, despite all the luxury, prestige and influence, being a Byzantine empress was probably not the dream job it appeared to be. It was, however, one of the most fascinating. The dangers of medieval travel begin the moment you leave home. Not when the bandits appear, not when the storm arrives, not when sickness strikes halfway through your journey. The real danger starts when the familiar world disappears behind you. It is dawn. A pale orange light spreads across the horizon as you stand at the edge of your village. Behind you are the thatched roofs, the fields you know by heart, and the people who have known you since childhood. Ahead lies a muddy road winding toward distant towns, forests, rivers, and countless unknowns. You adjust the strap of your travel bag and take one final look back. For most medieval people, this would be a strange sight. The vast majority never travelled far from where they were born. A peasant might spend an entire lifetime within a radius of 10 or 15 miles. Everything they needed was nearby: family, work, church, and market. The world beyond that was often little more than rumour. A traveller returning from another region might describe towering cities, foreign languages, dangerous mountains, or strange customs. For many listeners, these stories sounded almost like fairy tales. Today, however, you are becoming one of those travellers. Perhaps you are a merchant carrying wool to a distant market. Perhaps a pilgrim heading toward a famous shrine. Maybe you are a messenger, a craftsman seeking work, or simply someone escaping hardship. Whatever your reason, you are stepping into a world with very few guarantees. There are no maps tucked into your pocket, no weather forecasts waiting on a glowing screen, no emergency services, no roadside hotels displaying vacancy signs. Even knowing where you are can become difficult. Many roads are little more than dirt tracks worn into the landscape over centuries. Signposts are rare. Local directions often sound suspiciously unhelpful. Follow the old oak tree. Which oak tree? The large one. The large, excellent. That narrows it down to only several thousand possibilities. As the morning progresses, your village shrinks behind you. The comforting sounds of home fade away. The road grows quieter. You begin noticing how alone you truly are. A distant rider appears on the horizon. Is he a merchant, a pilgrim, a harmless farmer, or someone who sees a lone traveller carrying valuables? In the medieval world, every stranger is a question mark, and before long, you will discover that the road itself can be just as dangerous as the people who travel upon it. The road may look empty, but that does not mean you are alone. In fact, one of the greatest dangers of medieval travel is the simple uncertainty of who might be watching from beyond the trees. As the day wears on, the countryside unfolds around you. Rolling fields give way to patches of woodland. The villages become farther apart. Travellers become rarer. Soon, hours pass without seeing another soul. At first, the solitude feels peaceful. Then it begins to feel unsettling. You start noticing every sound: a snapping twig, a rustling bush, the distant clatter of hooves. Your hand instinctively tightens around your walking staff. Unlike the heroic stories told by wandering minstrels, most medieval travellers were not armed knights. They were merchants carrying goods, pilgrims carrying donations, craftsmen carrying tools, or peasants carrying whatever possessions they could afford. In other words, they were attractive targets. Banditry existed throughout medieval Europe. Some robbers were desperate men driven by poverty. Others were former soldiers who discovered that stealing from travellers was easier than farming. A few operated in organised groups, watching busy roads and striking when opportunities appeared. Forests were particularly feared. A dense woodland could hide dozens of men without revealing a single one. Roads often narrowed beneath thick canopies where sunlight barely reached the ground. Visibility disappeared. Escape routes vanished. If trouble emerged, help was usually far away. Imagine yourself entering such a forest. The birds suddenly stop singing, the road bends sharply. Then you notice movement ahead. 3 men step from behind the trees. Not armoured knights, not royal officials, just rough-looking figures carrying clubs and knives. At that moment, you face a difficult calculation. Can you run? Probably not. Can you fight? Perhaps. But even victory might leave you wounded miles from assistance. Can you talk your way out? Many travellers tried. Some handed over a few coins and continued their journey. Others lost everything they owned. The unlucky sometimes lost far more. This constant possibility shaped how people travelled. Merchants often joined caravans. Pilgrims gathered in groups. Travellers waited at inns for companions before crossing dangerous stretches of road. There was safety in numbers. Even a small group could discourage opportunistic thieves looking for easy prey. As evening approaches, you finally emerge from the forest unharmed. Relief washes over you, but you quickly learn an important lesson of medieval travel. The danger is not the bandit you can see. The danger is the one you never knew was there, and unfortunately, human threats are only part of the problem. The sky itself is beginning to darken. The bandits never appeared. At least, not today. But as you continue down the road, you begin discovering another unpleasant truth about medieval travel. Nature does not care whether you reach your destination. The dark clouds gathering overhead are proof of that. At first it seems harmless enough. A few grey patches drift across the sky. The wind grows cooler. Leaves rustle through the trees. You keep walking. Then the first raindrop lands on your shoulder. Another strikes your cheek. Within minutes, the heavens open. Rain in the modern world is an inconvenience. Rain in the medieval world can become a genuine threat. Your cloak quickly absorbs water. The road beneath your feet transforms into thick mud. Every step becomes heavier than the last. Your boots sink into the ground. Wheels of passing carts carve deep ruts that fill with water. Soon the road barely resembles a road at all. Medieval routes were rarely paved outside major cities and important trade roads. Most were dirt tracks. During heavy rain, they became rivers of mud capable of slowing travellers to a crawl. A journey expected to take 3 days might suddenly require 5. Food supplies run lower, money runs thinner, tempers grow shorter, and that is merely the beginning. The wind intensifies. Rain lashes sideways across the countryside. Visibility shrinks. Hills disappear behind curtains of water. Landmarks become difficult to recognise. You are no longer certain where the road actually goes. For medieval travellers, getting lost was a constant possibility. There are no road maps tucked inside your bag. No helpful voice announcing that you should turn left in 200 yards. Instead, there is only rain, mud, and your increasingly questionable sense of direction. Then comes thunder. A loud crack echoes across the sky. You instinctively flinch. People in the Middle Ages often viewed violent storms with a mixture of fear and awe. Many believed extreme weather carried divine meaning. A powerful storm might be interpreted as a warning, a punishment, or a sign from heaven. Standing alone in an open field while lightning tears across the sky, it is not difficult to understand why. You desperately need shelter, a farmhouse, a monastery, even a simple barn, anything with a roof. As darkness begins approaching, you spot a small structure in the distance. Relief floods through you as you hurry toward it, but another lesson of medieval travel soon becomes clear. Finding shelter during a storm is difficult. Finding safe shelter is even harder. And tonight, the approaching building may not be as welcoming as it first appears. The building ahead looks like salvation. After hours of battling rain, mud, and growing darkness, even the sight of a roof feels like a miracle. You quicken your pace. The storm continues to roar overhead. Water runs down your face. Your cloak weighs nearly twice as much as it did this morning. Every step produces a wet squelch from your boots. For a moment, all you can think about is getting dry. Then you reach the building and discover that shelter is not always guaranteed. The structure is a roadside inn, little more than a timber hall with a stable attached to one side. Light spills from narrow windows. Smoke rises from the chimney. Voices drift from inside. It looks inviting. It also looks expensive. Medieval inns varied enormously. Some offered reasonable accommodation to travellers. Others saw exhausted strangers as opportunities to extract every coin possible. You push through the door. Warmth immediately surrounds you. A fire crackles in the hearth. The smell of stew fills the room. Travellers sit on benches eating, drinking, and discussing news from distant towns. For the first time all day, you feel human again. Then the innkeeper names his price. Suddenly, sleeping in a muddy ditch seems financially competitive. Travel was expensive, even when everything went according to plan. Food cost money, lodging cost money, ferry crossings cost money, bridge tolls cost money. The road had a remarkable talent for emptying purses. If you lacked sufficient funds, your options became unpleasant. Some travellers slept in barns with livestock. Others sheltered beneath trees. Some spent nights in abandoned ruins, churches, or wherever they could avoid freezing. None of these choices were particularly comfortable, nor were they always safe. Imagine choosing the cheaper option and sleeping outdoors. The rain eventually stops. The sky clears. Stars appear overhead. It sounds almost romantic, until the temperature drops. Without modern insulation, sleeping equipment, or proper shelter, a cold night could become dangerous. Exposure weakened the body, reduced energy, and made illness more likely. Even inside an inn, conditions were rarely luxurious. Private rooms were uncommon. Many travellers slept together in crowded chambers. Complete strangers shared beds. Snoring echoed from every corner. Fleas considered themselves paying guests. Personal space was largely a future invention. Still, most travellers accepted these discomforts gladly, because outside those walls lurked darkness, and darkness brought its own collection of dangers. As you settle onto a crowded mattress surrounded by strangers, you listen to the wind outside and feel grateful for a roof overhead. Yet sleep does not come easily. Not when you have no idea who is sleeping beside you. You finally have a roof over your head. Unfortunately, so does everyone else. The inn's common sleeping room is crowded with travellers from every direction imaginable. Merchants returning from market, pilgrims heading toward distant shrines, messengers carrying news, labourers searching for work, a few individuals whose occupations seem deliberately vague. You lie on a thin mattress stuffed with straw and try to get comfortable. The attempt fails immediately. Someone nearby is snoring with the force of a siege engine. Another traveller coughs endlessly in the darkness. A man across the room talks in his sleep. Somewhere, a dog barks. The room smells of wet wool, smoke, leather, and humanity. Mostly humanity. Privacy is almost non-existent. Modern travellers worry about hotel reviews. Medieval travellers worried about waking up with all their possessions still attached to them. Before closing your eyes, you check your bag for the third time. Your money pouch remains hidden beneath your clothing. Good. You check again 10 minutes later. Still there. Excellent. Many medieval travellers slept with valuables physically tied to their bodies. Theft was a constant concern. An inn might provide protection from storms and wild animals, but it could also gather dozens of strangers under one roof. Not all of them were trustworthy. Some thieves specifically targeted inns. They knew exhausted travellers often slept deeply after long days on the road. A missing purse discovered at sunrise could be impossible to recover. The thief might already be miles away. Yet theft was not the only danger lurking inside crowded accommodations. There was also disease. The medieval world had little understanding of germs. People knew sickness could spread, but they did not know exactly how or why. Travellers regularly shared beds, blankets, cups, benches, and dining tables with complete strangers. Every crowded inn became a meeting place for more than just people. Fleas arrived, lice arrived, various illnesses arrived as well. The traveller coughing in the corner might simply have a cold, or something far worse, and there is no convenient way to find out. As the night deepens, conversations gradually fade. The fire burns lower. One by one, the room falls silent. Almost. Your eyes begin closing. Then suddenly, a loud argument erupts downstairs. Voices rise, furniture scrapes, someone shouts. For a moment, everyone in the room awakens. You realise another uncomfortable truth about medieval travel. The people sharing your shelter may be just as dangerous as the darkness outside. Eventually the commotion settles. Sleep finally arrives. But when dawn comes, a new challenge will be waiting. Because the greatest enemy of many medieval travellers was not bandits, storms, or thieves. It was sickness. The morning begins with a cough. Not your cough, someone else's. The traveller sleeping 2 mattresses away has been coughing since before dawn. Harsh, deep, rattling coughs that echo through the room. By breakfast, 2 more people seem to be coughing as well. Nobody thinks much of it. People are always coughing. Yet for a medieval traveller, sickness was one of the most feared dangers on the road. A bandit might rob you. A storm might delay you. An illness could end your journey entirely. You leave the inn shortly after sunrise. The weather has improved. The road stretches ahead beneath clear skies. Birds sing from nearby hedges. Everything seems pleasant. But appearances can be deceiving. The medieval world was full of diseases that modern medicine now prevents, treats, or manages. Travellers faced dysentery, fevers, infected wounds, food poisoning, and countless illnesses whose causes nobody fully understood. Doctors were scarce outside towns and cities. Effective treatments were even scarcer. If you became seriously ill in a remote area, you were largely dependent upon luck, rest, and whatever remedies local people happened to know. Unfortunately, luck was not always reliable. Travel itself weakened the body. Long days of walking exhausted muscles. Poor sleep reduced energy. Exposure to rain and cold lowered resistance. Food quality varied dramatically from place to place. Some days you might enjoy a hearty meal. Other days dinner consisted of stale bread, weak ale and optimism. The optimism was usually the least filling part. Water presented another challenge. Finding clean drinking water was not always easy. Streams could be contaminated by animals. Wells might be poorly maintained. Travellers often preferred weak ale because it was sometimes safer than uncertain water supplies. Imagine spending several days on the road. Your feet are blistered. Your clothes remain damp from recent storms. You are sleeping poorly and eating irregularly. Then one morning you wake feeling unusually tired. By noon, your stomach hurts. By evening you have developed a fever. Now every mile feels twice as long. The nearest town may still be days away. The nearest healer may be even farther. Many medieval journeys ended not with dramatic attacks or heroic adventures, but with simple illness. A fever that became worse. A wound that became infected. A stomach sickness that led to dehydration. Quiet dangers. Invisible dangers. The kind that arrive without warning. As the sun begins setting, you notice another traveller ahead moving slowly along the road. He limps badly. Every step appears painful. And as you draw closer, you realise his problem began with something surprisingly small. A simple injury to the foot. The limping traveller ahead of you does not look particularly alarming. There is no dramatic wound. No broken bones sticking out. No blood-soaked bandages. Just a man walking slowly, favouring one foot with every painful step. Yet in the medieval world, a seemingly minor injury could become a serious problem remarkably quickly. As you catch up to him, you notice his boot has been patched several times. The leather is worn thin. Each step causes him to wince. A blister. That is all it started as. Days of walking had rubbed the skin raw. The blister burst. Dirt entered the wound. The wound became inflamed. Now every mile is an ordeal. Modern travellers rarely think much about their feet. Medieval travellers thought about them constantly. Your feet were your transportation. A horse was expensive. A wagon was not always available. Most journeys happened one step at a time. If your feet failed, everything else failed with them. The roads certainly did not help. Some stretches were muddy swamps. Others were rocky tracks littered with sharp stones. Tree roots crossed pathways. Hidden holes twisted ankles. River crossings soaked boots for hours. Every day presented countless opportunities for injury. And injuries had a dangerous habit of becoming worse. Without modern antibiotics, even a small cut could become infected. A thorn lodged in the skin might lead to swelling. A scraped knee could develop into a painful wound. People understood that infections were dangerous. They simply did not fully understand why. Local remedies varied enormously. Some were surprisingly effective. Others were based more on hope than medicine. Herbs might be applied. Poultices might be wrapped around wounds. Prayers might be offered. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they did not. Imagine yourself travelling for several days when disaster strikes. Perhaps you slip while crossing a stream. Perhaps you stumble on loose rocks. Perhaps a horse kicks unexpectedly. The injury may not kill you. The real problem is what comes afterward. You are still miles from your destination. You still need food. You still need shelter. And now every movement hurts. A healthy traveller can cover 20 miles in a day. An injured traveller may struggle to cover 5. The road suddenly becomes much longer than it was yesterday. As evening approaches, the limping man eventually stops beside a tree, unable to continue any farther. You continue onward, but his situation lingers in your thoughts. Because another danger is waiting ahead, one that no amount of healthy feet can solve. Soon, the road itself will disappear. A river blocks your path, and crossing it may prove more dangerous than walking it. The road has carried you through forests, storms, and sleepless nights. Now it comes to an abrupt stop. Ahead lies a river. Not a mighty river like the Rhine or the Danube, but large enough to block your path completely. The water rushes between muddy banks, swollen by recent rainfall. Sunlight glitters across the surface, making it look almost inviting. Almost. Because medieval travellers knew that rivers could be surprisingly deadly. You approach the bank and search for a bridge. There is one. Unfortunately, so is everyone else. A line of merchants, peasants, pilgrims and wagon drivers stretches toward the crossing. At the entrance stands a collector waiting patiently for payment. Naturally. The medieval world had discovered tolls long before it discovered convenience. Many bridges were privately maintained by local lords, monasteries, or towns. Travellers often paid a fee to cross safely. Refusing to pay usually meant finding another route. That alternative was rarely appealing. You hand over your coins and step onto the wooden structure. Immediately, the bridge creaks beneath your weight. That is not especially comforting. Medieval bridges varied enormously in quality. Some were impressive stone constructions capable of lasting centuries. Others looked as though they were engaged in an ongoing argument with gravity. This particular bridge appears undecided about whether it wants to remain standing. The river churns below. You suddenly walk much faster. Not every crossing involved a bridge. Many travellers relied on ferries. Others used fords, shallow sections where people, horses and carts could pass through the water. These crossings carried their own dangers. River levels changed constantly. A ford that seemed safe one week might become treacherous after heavy rain. Fast-moving water could sweep away horses, wagons and people alike. Imagine trying to cross with a heavily loaded cart. The wheels sink into the riverbed. The current pushes against the horses. Water rises higher and higher. One wrong step. One frightened animal. One broken wheel. Suddenly, the journey becomes a struggle for survival. Medieval records contain numerous accounts of travellers drowning during river crossings. Some disappeared entirely. Others were carried downstream along with their goods, supplies, and hopes of reaching their destination. The river did not care whether you were a peasant or a nobleman. Water treated everyone equally. You eventually reach the opposite bank safely and continue your journey. The bridge fades behind you. But another realization begins to settle in. The closer you get to your destination, the more exhausted you have become. Your feet ache. Your supplies are running low. Your nerves are frayed. And tomorrow you will face perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Simply finding the strength to keep going. The destination is finally close. After days on the road, you can see the walls of the town rising in the distance. Smoke curls above rooftops. Church bells drift across the countryside. Merchants, farmers and travellers move along the road ahead. You should feel triumphant. Instead, you feel exhausted. Your boots are worn. Your food supplies are nearly gone. Your shoulders ache from carrying your belongings, and you have learned more about medieval travel than you ever wanted to know. The final miles are often the hardest. Not because they are the most dangerous, but because every challenge from the journey has accumulated. Small discomforts become large ones. Minor aches become constant companions. You are tired in a way that settles deep into the bones. As you approach the town gate, you pass other travellers arriving from different directions. A merchant leading weary pack animals. A pilgrim whose cloak is stained with mud from several countries. A messenger riding a horse that looks as exhausted as its owner. All of them share the same expression: relief. Because reaching a destination in the medieval world was never guaranteed. Every successful arrival represented dozens of dangers avoided. The bandits did not catch you. The storm did not stop you. The illness did not overcome you. The river did not claim you. The road, despite all its efforts, failed to defeat you. That alone is an achievement. Modern people often imagine medieval travel as a grand adventure filled with castles, heroic encounters, and dramatic discoveries. The Roman conquest of Hispania began as a war against Carthage. It ended almost 200 years later. That fact alone tells you everything you need to know about the people Rome was about to face. In the year 218 before Christ, Roman ships appeared along the eastern coast of the Iberian Peninsula. The Roman Republic was locked in a desperate struggle with its greatest rival, Carthage. Across the Mediterranean, the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal had just launched one of history's most audacious campaigns, marching toward Italy and threatening Rome itself. To the Romans, Hispania was not yet a prize to conquer. It was a battlefield, a place where silver mines funded Carthaginian armies, where tribal warriors filled Hannibal's ranks, and where Roman generals hoped to cut the enemy's lifeline. The plan seemed simple. Defeat the Carthaginians, take their ports, destroy their influence, go home. Unfortunately for Rome, Hispania had other ideas. The land stretching beyond the Mediterranean coast was unlike anything most Roman commanders had encountered. Vast mountain ranges divided regions from one another. Thick forests covered valleys. Rugged plateaus stretched endlessly across the interior. Rivers cut through the landscape like natural fortifications. Even more challenging were the people who lived there. The peninsula was not a single kingdom waiting to be defeated. It was home to dozens of tribes and cultures. Iberians occupied much of the eastern and southern regions. Celtiberian peoples dominated parts of the interior. In the west lived the Lusitanians. In the north, fierce mountain tribes remained largely untouched by outside powers. They spoke different languages. They followed different customs. They often fought one another. Yet they shared one important characteristic. They had absolutely no interest in becoming subjects of Rome. At first, Roman victories came quickly. The famous general Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, captured the great Carthaginian base of New Carthage. One by one, Carthaginian armies were defeated. Eventually, Rome emerged victorious from the Second Punic War. The original mission had been accomplished. The enemy was gone. The logical thing would have been to leave. Rome, however, rarely left profitable territory behind. Hispania possessed rich silver mines, fertile farmland, and valuable trade routes. Roman senators looked westward and saw wealth waiting to be collected. What they did not see was the long nightmare ahead. Because while Carthage had been defeated, the tribes of Hispania remained. And unlike Carthage, they had no capital city to capture, no single king to overthrow, and no intention of surrendering. The real conquest was only beginning. The conquest should have been over. Carthage was defeated. Its armies had been driven from Hispania. Its ports belonged to Rome. Its silver mines were now filling Roman coffers instead of Carthaginian ones. By every measure familiar to Roman generals, victory had been achieved. Yet the fighting continued. Year after year, decade after decade, eventually generation after generation. The reason was simple. Rome had defeated an empire. Now it had to conquer a land. And Hispania was determined to make that as difficult as possible. The Roman Republic had grown accustomed to fighting enemies who could be beaten in familiar ways. Capture a city, defeat a king, destroy an army, negotiate a treaty. The machinery of conquest was well practiced. In Hispania, those rules rarely applied. The peninsula was enormous. Mountains split entire regions apart. Deep valleys concealed villages from outsiders. Dense forests swallowed roads and armies alike. harsh plateaus stretched for miles beneath an unforgiving sun. Roman maps were often incomplete. Roman knowledge was limited. Roman confidence would soon suffer the same fate. Imagine being a Roman commander arriving from Italy. You expect open battles and clear objectives. Instead, local tribes seem to appear from nowhere. One day they swear loyalty. The next day they attack your supply wagons. One village welcomes Roman merchants. Another ambushes Roman patrols. It was enough to give a governor grey hair several years ahead of schedule. The tribes themselves were incredibly diverse. The Iberians along the Mediterranean coast had long traded with foreign peoples. Some cities adopted aspects of Greek and Phoenician culture. Others prospered through commerce and agriculture. Farther inland lived the Celtiberians, fierce warriors whose culture blended Celtic and Iberian traditions. Their hilltop settlements overlooked strategic valleys and mountain passes. Then there were the Lusitanians of the West. To Roman writers, they seemed almost impossible to control. They moved quickly through difficult terrain, fought aggressively, and vanished before Roman forces could respond. And beyond them, in the rugged northern mountains, tribes lived in regions so remote that many Romans viewed them as existing at the edge of the known world. The greatest challenge was that there was no single enemy. Even when Rome defeated one tribe, another would rise. Even when one region was pacified, another erupted into rebellion. Victory never seemed permanent. Every campaign appeared to solve one problem while creating three more. The Senate in Rome expected quick results. The generals in Hispania knew better, because the deeper they marched into the peninsula, the more they realized a troubling truth. The tribes were learning how to fight Rome. And soon, one man would emerge who could unite that resistance better than anyone before him. The tribes of Hispania were learning how to fight Rome, and before long they found a leader who seemed born for that purpose. His name was Viriathus. To the Romans, he would become a nightmare. To many people in Hispania, he became a hero. The story begins in the rugged lands of Lusitania in western Hispania. Roman sources claim Viriathus was once a shepherd. Others suggest he may have worked as a hunter or herdsman. Whatever his origins, one thing is clear. He did not come from a royal family. He was not a wealthy noble. He was not a celebrated military commander. At least not yet. What transformed him was Rome itself. In the middle of the 2nd century before Christ, Roman governors in Hispania were under constant pressure to deliver victories, wealth, and stability. Some attempted diplomacy, others preferred harsher methods. One of those governors was Servius Sulpicius Galba. He offered peace to thousands of Lusitanians who had been fighting Roman forces. According to ancient accounts, the Lusitanians accepted his terms and gathered where instructed, expecting land and reconciliation. Instead, they were massacred. Men, women, and children were slaughtered or sold into slavery. It was one of the darkest episodes of the Roman conquest. And somehow, Viriathus survived. If he had merely hated Rome afterward, history might have forgotten him. Instead, he decided to fight. What made Viriathus dangerous was not just courage, it was intelligence. Roman commanders expected tribal warriors to charge recklessly into battle. Viriathus refused to cooperate with that expectation. He understood the mountains, forests, and valleys of western Hispania better than any Roman general ever could. When Roman armies advanced, he disappeared. When they relaxed, he struck. When they chased him, he led them into difficult terrain. When they retreated, he attacked their rear. It was infuriating. Roman legions were designed for decisive battles. Viriathus avoided decisive battles whenever possible. He relied on speed, surprise, and local knowledge. Again and again, Roman armies marched confidently into Lusitania. Again and again, they returned humiliated. The shepherd had become a commander. The commander had become a symbol. More importantly, tribes that normally quarrelled among themselves began rallying around him. For the first time, Rome faced something truly dangerous in Hispania. Not a city, not a tribe, not a rebellion. A leader capable of turning resistance into a movement. And with every Roman defeat, the legend of VIII grew larger. As the legend of VIII grew in the west, another challenge was emerging in the heart of Hispania. A city. Not a grand metropolis filled with marble temples and towering monuments. Not a wealthy trading centre commanding vast resources. Just a small hilltop settlement called Numantia. Yet this modest Celtiberian city would embarrass Rome for nearly 20 years, and in the process become one of the greatest symbols of resistance in ancient history. Located in the rugged uplands of central Hispania, Numantia occupied a naturally defensive position. Surrounded by hills and difficult terrain, it overlooked the approaches that any invading army would need to use. The city itself was not particularly large. Its defenders, however, possessed something Rome increasingly found difficult to conquer: determination. The conflict began when Roman authorities attempted to tighten their control over the Celtiberian tribes. As always, Rome expected resistance. What it did not expect was how effectively that resistance would be organised. Again and again, Roman armies marched into the region. Again and again, they failed. Some commanders underestimated their opponents. Others suffered from poor planning. A few simply discovered that the warriors of Numantia had no intention of cooperating with Rome's timetable for conquest. One Roman army after another returned home defeated, frustrated, or humiliated. At one point, a Roman consul found himself trapped and forced into an agreement with the Numantines to save his army from destruction. The Senate in Rome was furious, not with the enemy, with their own commander. The treaty was rejected. The war continued. Naturally. Rome had many admirable qualities, but admitting defeat was rarely one of them. As the years passed, Numantia gained an almost mythical reputation. Roman soldiers spoke of it with frustration. Senators spoke of it with embarrassment. How could the greatest power in the Mediterranean be held at bay by a relatively small city in the mountains? The answer was becoming painfully obvious. The Numantines understood something Rome did not. They were fighting for survival. Rome was fighting for prestige. One side was always going to be more motivated. The situation became so embarrassing that Roman leaders finally decided drastic action was necessary. The city could no longer be treated as a local problem. It required one of Rome's most capable commanders. A man who had already destroyed Carthage itself. A man whose reputation carried weight throughout the Mediterranean. His name was Scipio Aemilianus. And when he arrived in Hispania, he brought something that had been missing from previous campaigns. Patience. Because he intended to defeat Numantia not by storming its walls, but by slowly choking the life out of it. The city of Numantia had humiliated Rome for nearly 2 decades. Roman armies had marched into the hills of central Hispania full of confidence and returned with little to show for it. Some commanders blamed the terrain. Others blamed bad luck. A few blamed their predecessors. The Senate was tired of excuses. If Numantia could not be conquered by ordinary generals, then Rome would send an extraordinary one. In 134 before Christ, Scipio Aemilianus arrived in Hispania. His reputation preceded him. This was the man who had captured and destroyed Carthage. the man whose name carried weight throughout the Mediterranean. Roman citizens expected him to finish the war quickly. Scipio took one look at the situation and realized why so many had failed. The problem was not Numantia. The problem was Rome. Years of frustration had damaged discipline within the army. Soldiers had grown comfortable. Officers had become careless. Campaigns lacked consistency. Too many commanders had chased glory instead of focusing on victory. Before attacking the enemy, Scipio decided to fix his own army. The reforms were brutal. Luxury items were removed from camp. Soldiers endured harsh training exercises. Marches became longer. Standards became stricter. Discipline returned. Many legionaries hated it. Scipio did not care. He understood an uncomfortable truth. A poorly disciplined Roman army was often more dangerous to itself than to its enemies. Once he was satisfied with his troops, Scipio made another surprising decision. He would not launch a grand assault against Numantia. Many commanders would have done exactly that. A dramatic attack promised glory and a quick resolution. It also promised heavy casualties. Instead, Scipio chose patience. The kind of patience that drives defenders slowly toward despair. Rather than storm the city, he surrounded it. Roman forces constructed an enormous ring of fortifications around Numantia. Camps, walls, trenches, towers, and defensive works gradually sealed off every route in or out. The city was becoming a prison. No food could enter. No reinforcements could arrive. No escape remained possible. The Numantines watched the trap tighten month after month. Yet they refused to surrender. That determination impressed even their enemies. As supplies dwindled, conditions inside the city became desperate. Hunger spread. People consumed whatever food remained. Ancient sources describe terrible suffering as starvation tightened its grip. Still, resistance continued. Scipio's strategy was working, not because he had defeated Numantia in battle, because he had made battle unnecessary. After months of isolation, the city finally reached its breaking point. And when the end came, it would leave a mark on Roman and Spanish memory for centuries. The fall of Numantia should have marked the end of serious resistance in Hispania. That is certainly what many Romans hoped. The city had been starved into submission. Its defenders had become legends. One of Rome's greatest generals had finally delivered the victory the Republic desperately wanted. Surely the rest of Hispania would now accept Roman rule. Surely the wars were over. They were not. In fact, some of the hardest fighting still lay ahead. For decades after Numantia's destruction, Rome gradually expanded its influence across the peninsula. New settlements appeared. Roads stretched across conquered territories. Mines poured wealth toward Italy. Roman governors collected taxes and enforced Roman authority. On maps in Rome, Hispania increasingly looked conquered. On the ground, reality was rather different. Far to the north, beyond the more developed regions of the peninsula, lay lands that remained stubbornly independent. Mountain ranges rose sharply from the landscape. Dense forests covered the slopes. Narrow valleys twisted through difficult terrain. This was the homeland of the Cantabrians and Asturians, and they had no intention of surrendering. To Roman observers, these tribes seemed fierce, stubborn, and almost impossible to intimidate. They lived in fortified hill settlements, relied heavily on livestock, and knew every mountain path better than any invading army ever could. Most importantly, they understood how to use the terrain. A Roman legion was a terrifying weapon on open ground. A Roman legion struggling through steep mountains was something else entirely. Imagine marching through narrow passes where enemies could attack from above. Imagine hauling supplies through forests where every shadow might conceal an ambush. Imagine trying to force a decisive battle against opponents who simply refuse to fight on your terms. The northern tribes excelled at exactly this kind of warfare. They struck quickly and disappeared. They raided Roman positions. They attacked supply lines. They turned the landscape itself into an ally. Roman commanders found themselves facing a familiar frustration. The enemy would not stay still. Generals arrived, promising quick victories. Instead, campaigns dragged on. Reports reached Rome describing ambushes, setbacks, and stubborn resistance. The mountains seemed to produce warriors faster than Rome could defeat them. Even worse, every Roman advance pushed deeper into territory that was difficult to govern and expensive to control. The Republic had conquered wealthy regions before. Now it was fighting for remote mountains, whose greatest value appeared to be producing rebellious tribesmen. Yet Rome could not simply leave, because every act of resistance challenged Roman authority, and by the time the 1st century before Christ approached, the question was no longer whether the north would be conquered. The question was, who would finally finish the job? The answer would come from Rome's first emperor himself. The answer would come from Rome's first emperor. His name was Augustus. By the late 1st century before Christ, the Roman world had changed dramatically. The republic that first entered Hispania during the war with Carthage was gone. Decades of civil wars had transformed Rome, and Augustus now stood at the centre of a new imperial system. Most of Hispania was under Roman control. Most. The northern mountains remained a problem. The Cantabrians and Asturians continued resisting Roman authority, raiding neighbouring territories, and refusing to acknowledge that Rome had supposedly won. For Augustus, this was unacceptable. An empire could tolerate many things. An unconquered enemy within its borders was not one of them. In 29 before Christ, Rome launched what became known as the Cantabrian Wars. These campaigns would represent the final chapter of the Roman conquest of Hispania, and they would prove far more difficult than expected. The northern tribes fought with the same determination that had frustrated Roman commanders for generations. They knew the mountains intimately. They avoided unnecessary battles. They struck isolated units and vanished into terrain where legions struggled to follow. Roman soldiers found themselves fighting not only warriors, but geography itself. The mountains seemed endless. The weather often turned hostile. Supply lines stretched across difficult terrain. Even experienced commanders found the campaigns exhausting. Augustus became so invested in the conflict that he personally travelled to Hispania to oversee operations. It was a rare demonstration of how seriously he viewed the war. Yet even the future emperor discovered that the north could be frustrating. At one point, illness forced him to leave active command and recover elsewhere, while his generals continued the campaign. The fighting dragged on. Year after year, Roman armies pushed deeper into tribal territory. Forts were constructed, roads were extended, reinforcements arrived. Gradually, the pressure began to tell. The tribes continued resisting fiercely, but Rome possessed something they lacked: time. Rome could replace losses. Rome could send more soldiers. Rome could keep fighting almost indefinitely. The mountain tribes could not. Ancient accounts describe desperate last stands, sieges, and acts of resistance that impressed even Roman writers. Some warriors reportedly chose death over surrender. Others continued fighting long after defeat seemed inevitable. The conflict became less a war of conquest and more a test of endurance. Eventually, endurance favoured Rome. The northern tribes were broken. The mountains that had resisted Roman authority for generations were finally brought under imperial control. After nearly 2 centuries of warfare, The conquest of Hispania was almost complete, but conquering a land and ruling it were two very different challenges. Conquering Hispania was one thing. Keeping it was another. For nearly 2 centuries, Roman armies had marched across the peninsula, fought countless battles, besieged rebellious cities, and buried thousands of soldiers. At last, the wars were ending. Now came the challenge that truly mattered. How do you turn a conquered land into part of an empire? Augustus understood that military victories alone would never guarantee lasting control. A legion could defeat an enemy army. It could not force an entire population to think of itself as Roman. That required a different strategy, a slower strategy, a strategy that often proved far more effective than war. Across Hispania, roads began spreading like arteries through the landscape. Roman engineers connected distant regions that had once been separated by mountains and wilderness. What had taken days to travel could now be crossed far more efficiently. Merchants benefited, officials benefited, the army benefited. Most importantly, Rome benefited. Where roads went, Roman influence followed. New cities appeared throughout the peninsula. Some were founded specifically for retired legionaries. Veterans received land grants and settled in Hispania, bringing Roman customs, language, and traditions with them. These settlements became islands of Roman culture. Then they became centres of Roman culture. Eventually, they became ordinary parts of daily life. Temples rose in city centres. Forums hosted markets and political gatherings. Bathhouses introduced comforts. Many local communities had never experienced before. Roman law gradually replaced tribal customs in many regions. Latin spread steadily across the peninsula, not overnight, not everywhere, but generation by generation. The transformation was remarkable. Children growing up in Roman towns often spoke Latin as their primary language. Local elites adopted Roman fashions. Wealthy families sent sons into Roman administration or military service. Some even became important figures within the empire itself. The irony was difficult to miss. The descendants of people who had once fought Rome now served Rome. Yet not everything changed. Local traditions survived. Regional identities remained strong. Ancient customs continued alongside Roman ones. Hispania did not become a copy of Italy. Instead, it became something new. A blend of Roman and local influences. Perhaps that is why the process succeeded where pure military force often failed. People were not simply being conquered, they were being absorbed. By the beginning of the 1st century after Christ, much of Hispania was peaceful, prosperous, and deeply connected to the wider Roman world. Looking around, it would have been difficult to imagine the centuries of warfare that had come before, but the legacy of those wars had not disappeared. In fact, Hispania was about to give something back to Rome. Something Rome never expected: its future rulers. The conquest was finally over. After nearly 2 centuries of warfare, Rome had achieved what countless generals had promised and many had failed to deliver. The tribes had been subdued. The mountains had been pacified. Roads crossed the peninsula. Cities flourished beneath Roman rule. Hispania was no longer a frontier. It was part of the empire. Yet history has a sense of irony. After spending generations trying to conquer Hispania, Rome would eventually find itself governed by men born there. In many ways, this was the ultimate sign that the conquest had succeeded. The children and grandchildren of former enemies were no longer outsiders. They were Romans. Long before you ever sing a poem before a king, long before your words can start a feud or preserve a hero's name for generations, someone must first decide that you are worth teaching. And in ancient Celtic society, that was no small decision. You are perhaps 8 or 9 years old when your journey begins. While other children spend their days tending livestock, carrying water, or helping in the fields, your future may be heading in a very different direction. Not because you are stronger, not because you are wealthier, but because someone believes you possess something rarer, a mind capable of remembering. The Celtic world places enormous value on memory. In a society where much knowledge is passed down orally, forgetting important information is not merely embarrassing, it can be disastrous. A lost genealogy might weaken a king's claim to power. A forgotten treaty could spark conflict. An incorrectly recited poem might offend an entire family. This is where the bards come in. To modern ears, the word bard may sound like a wandering musician carrying a harp and singing pleasant songs by a campfire. The reality is far more impressive. A bard is a historian, poet, entertainer, advisor, diplomat, and living archive all rolled into one. He preserves the memory of his people. He remembers who ruled, who fought, who married whom, and who deserves glory or shame. In many Celtic societies, especially in Ireland and parts of Britain, a skilled bard commands enormous respect, sometimes even fear. After all, a warrior's spear can wound the body. A bard's words can wound a reputation for generations. As a result, families often view bardic training as a prestigious opportunity. Not everyone is eligible. The education is long, difficult, and requires years of dedication. This is not a profession for someone hoping to avoid homework. In fact, it may involve more homework than almost any occupation in the ancient world. Imagine spending years memorizing thousands upon thousands of lines of poetry without writing them down. Suddenly tending sheep starts looking surprisingly attractive. Eventually, arrangements are made. A respected bard agrees to accept you as a student. Your family prepares for your departure. The moment feels exciting. It also feels frightening. Because becoming a bard does not happen at home. To begin learning the secrets of poetry, music, and memory, you must leave behind everything familiar. And soon you will discover that the path to becoming a bard is far more demanding than anyone warned you. The path to becoming a bard begins with a goodbye, not a dramatic farewell filled with tears and speeches. Ancient Celtic families are generally practical people. There are animals to feed, fields to tend, and daily life to continue. Still, the moment carries weight. You are leaving home. Perhaps not forever, but for many years. The respected bard who has agreed to train you lives far from your family's settlement. He may serve a local king, belong to a renowned bardic family, or oversee a small school where several apprentices study together. Whatever the arrangement, your childhood is about to change. The journey itself feels significant. As you travel through forests, valleys, and winding tracks, you leave behind the world you know. Familiar faces disappear. Familiar routines vanish. Ahead lies a future built almost entirely around learning. And not the pleasant kind of learning where someone occasionally compliments your effort. The demanding kind. The bard who greets you is not impressed by your arrival. He is not interested in your potential. Potential means nothing. Results matter. Many bardic teachers expect strict discipline from the very beginning. The profession carries prestige because it requires mastery, and mastery demands effort. A great deal of effort. You quickly discover that being accepted as a student is not the same as becoming a bard. It is merely permission to begin suffering toward that goal. Your days soon settle into a routine. You wake early. You assist with chores. You observe older students. You listen carefully. Most importantly, you begin memorizing. At first the lessons seem manageable. Short poems, traditional stories. names of important families. Then the lists grow longer and longer and longer. Soon you find yourself trying to remember genealogies stretching back generations. One mistake, and you start again. The ancient Celts place enormous trust in trained memory. Unlike many societies that increasingly rely on written records, much important knowledge remains oral. A bard must be able to recite information accurately without hesitation. There are no convenient notes hidden in your sleeve, no scroll waiting for consultation, no helpful reminder carved into a stone. Your mind must become the library. That realization arrives quickly and somewhat painfully. The older students make it look easy. It is not. You watch them recite lengthy poems flawlessly and wonder if they possess supernatural powers. They do not. They simply have years of training ahead of you. As evening falls and the lessons finally end, you realize something important. Becoming a bard is not about learning a few songs. It is about reshaping the way your mind works. And tomorrow, the true challenge begins. You will start learning the art that separates ordinary students from future masters. The art of remembering everything. Your mind must become the library. That realization settles over you on the first morning of serious instruction. Until now, you have been learning simple verses and short stories. Difficult, certainly, but manageable. You can still imagine yourself becoming a bard someday. Then your teacher begins the real lessons. Suddenly, the task ahead seems enormous. Ancient Celtic societies possess vast amounts of knowledge that must be preserved. Genealogies stretch back through countless generations. Heroic tales contain hundreds of names. Laws, treaties, boundaries, and traditions must all be remembered accurately. A mistake is not simply a mistake. It can alter history. Imagine standing before a king and accidentally giving his great-grandfather's achievements to a rival family. That is the sort of error that can make a room become very quiet, very quickly. Your teacher understands this, which is why he shows little sympathy. Hour after hour, you listen and repeat. Listen and repeat. Listen and repeat. At times it feels less like education and more like a very elaborate torture designed by someone who hated children. The older students seem amused by your struggle. Naturally. They suffered through the same process years ago. The secret, your teacher explains, is structure. Knowledge is not memorized randomly. Poems use rhythm, patterns, and carefully arranged language. Stories follow familiar forms. Genealogies are grouped into sequences that make them easier to retain. A trained bard learns to build mental pathways. One memory leads naturally to the next. One verse unlocks another. One story opens the door to 10 more. Slowly, your mind begins adapting. At first you remember dozens of lines, then hundreds, eventually thousands. The progress is gradual enough that you barely notice it happening. Until one day, a younger student arrives. You watch him struggle with a short poem that now seems effortless. For the first time, you realize how far you have come. That realization feels wonderful. It lasts approximately 5 minutes. Then your teacher introduces a far longer piece. Ancient bardic training is remarkably good at preventing excessive confidence. The challenge never stops growing. Some traditions suggest advanced students memorized material for years before reaching full status. Entire bodies of poetry, history, and tradition lived inside their minds. The responsibility is staggering, because every lesson carries the same message. You are not learning this knowledge for yourself. You are preserving it for everyone else. And as your memory improves, another challenge begins to emerge. Remembering the words is only the beginning. Soon you must learn how to transform those words into poetry worthy of a king's hall. Learning how to remember thousands of lines is impressive. Learning how to transform those lines into poetry worthy of a king is something else entirely. By now, you have spent years under your teacher's supervision. The excitement of becoming a bard has faded. In its place stands a more realistic understanding of the profession. This is work, a tremendous amount of work. Your days begin before sunrise. The Bardic School is not a grand academy with marble halls and comfortable lecture rooms. Depending on the region and period, it may be little more than a respected teacher's household, a cluster of buildings, or a gathering place where students live and study together. Whatever its appearance, the expectations remain the same. Excellence. You rise early and join the other students. Some are younger than you. Others are approaching the end of their training. The older apprentices command respect because they have survived years of lessons that many never complete. You secretly suspect they are also slightly insane. After all, anyone who voluntarily memorizes several thousand lines of poetry must be viewed with at least a little suspicion. The morning lessons often focus on recitation. Students stand one by one and deliver passages from memory. Every mistake is noticed. Every hesitation is corrected. Your teacher possesses an almost supernatural ability to detect errors. A missing word, a misplaced phrase, a slight change in rhythm, nothing escapes him. At times, you wonder if he sleeps at all or simply spends the night waiting for students to make mistakes. The afternoon brings new challenges: history, genealogies, law, poetry, music. A bard is expected to master far more than storytelling. He must understand the traditions that hold society together. He must know which families are connected, which heroes belong to which legends, and which ancient agreements still matter. Knowledge becomes a form of power. The competitions between students are particularly intense. Apprentices challenge one another in recitations and poetic exercises. Quick thinking is admired. Sharp memory earns respect. Friendly rivalries develop, mostly friendly. Sometimes a student spends weeks preparing for a contest only to forget a crucial line halfway through. Those moments tend to be remembered by everyone, except the unfortunate student. As evening approaches, the lessons continue by firelight. Voices recite verses into the darkness. Harps sound softly in the background. Teachers listen carefully, correcting mistakes that seem invisible to everyone else. The years pass this way, slowly, relentlessly, patiently shaping students into something greater. Because soon, memorizing knowledge will no longer be enough. You must learn how to perform it, and that means mastering the powerful combination of poetry and music. Memorizing knowledge is only half the battle. A bard is not judged solely by what he knows. He is judged by how well he can bring that knowledge to life. After all, a perfectly remembered poem delivered badly is still a bad performance. And no king wants to sit through several hours of bad poetry. Even in the ancient world, audiences had limits. By this stage of your training, your teacher begins focusing on the skills that separate scholars from performers. The lessons become more demanding, more creative, and in many ways more intimidating. Because now people are listening. You learn that Celtic poetry is not simply a collection of rhyming lines. It follows intricate structures, patterns, rhythms, and rules. Certain forms require precise syllable counts. Others depend on complex sound patterns and carefully arranged phrasing. Every word matters. Every pause matters. Every mistake becomes painfully obvious. At first, constructing a proper poem feels impossible. You spend hours choosing the right phrase, only for your teacher to point out that it breaks the rhythm. You revise it. Now the rhythm works, but the meaning suffers. You revise again. The process continues. Gradually, however, the rules stop feeling restrictive. Instead, they become tools. The same way a blacksmith learns to shape metal, you learn to shape language. Alongside poetry comes music. The harp becomes one of your closest companions. Its strings accompany stories, praise poems, laments, and heroic tales. Learning to play requires patience. Fingers ache. Notes are missed. Rhythms stumble. The harp does not care how much history you have memorized. It demands practice from everyone equally. Many evenings are spent repeating the same melodies again and again, while older students try very hard not to laugh at your mistakes. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they do not. Performance itself becomes a lesson. You must stand confidently before an audience. Your voice must carry across crowded halls filled with warriors, nobles, and guests. You must command attention without appearing arrogant. That balance is surprisingly difficult. A timid bard is ignored. An overly proud bard becomes annoying. Finding the middle ground takes years. Slowly, your confidence grows. Poems flow more naturally. The harp feels familiar beneath your hands. Stories that once seemed difficult now emerge effortlessly. For the first time, you begin to resemble a true bard. But your teacher warns you not to become comfortable. Because poetry and music are not merely entertainment. In Celtic society, a bard's words carry real power. Enough power to honour a king, or destroy his reputation. A bard's words can honour a king. They can also ruin one. That is why rulers across the Celtic world treat skilled bards with a mixture of admiration, generosity, and just a hint of nervousness. By now, you have spent years mastering poetry, music, and performance. You know how to hold an audience's attention. You can recite histories, stretching back generations. Your harp no longer sounds as though it is actively protesting your touch. But now you must learn the most important lesson of all. Words have consequences. In Celtic society, reputation matters enormously. A king's authority depends not only on warriors and wealth, but also on honour. His fame spreads through stories. His victories are remembered through poems. His generosity becomes known through the accounts of those who witness it. And who preserves those accounts? The bards. A great praise poem can elevate a ruler's status across an entire region. Guests at feasts hear it. Travellers repeat it. Future generations remember it. In a world without newspapers, television, or social media, the bard becomes one of the most powerful voices available. You are, in effect, the public relations department of the Iron Age, except with considerably better poetry. Your teacher explains that praise must be earned. A bard is expected to celebrate genuine achievements. A brave warrior deserves recognition. A generous king deserves admiration. False praise damages the bard's credibility. And credibility is everything. Yet praise is only one side of the profession. The other side is satire. This is where things become interesting. Many Celtic traditions believed that a skilled bard's satire carried extraordinary power. Some stories even suggest that a devastating satirical poem could bring shame, misfortune, or social ruin upon its target. Whether people believed such claims literally hardly mattered. The fear was real. Imagine spending years building your reputation only to become the subject of a poem mocking your cowardice, greed, or foolish behaviour. Worse still, imagine everyone enjoying it. Kings understood this danger perfectly. As a result, rulers often treated bards with remarkable respect. Gifts were given, hospitality was offered, seats of honour were reserved, partly out of admiration, partly out of self-preservation. As you begin composing your own poems, you realize the responsibility involved. A careless phrase can offend. An unfair criticism can create enemies. A well-crafted poem can shape how an entire community remembers a person. You are no longer simply learning stories. You are learning how stories influence society itself. And soon, those skills will take you beyond the classroom, because a bard's education does not end at school. The wider Celtic world is waiting. The wider Celtic world is waiting. After years of training, memorization, and discipline, your teacher finally allows you to leave the safety of the bardic school and experience the profession as it truly exists. Not in lessons, not in exercises, but in the halls of kings and chiefs. For the first time, you accompany experienced bards as they travel between territories. The journey itself is an education. Roads are often little more than muddy tracks. Forests stretch for miles. Rivers must be crossed. Villages appear and disappear across the landscape. Yet wherever you go, one thing remains constant. People value stories. As you approach a tribal stronghold, messengers announce your arrival. Hospitality is offered. Food is prepared. Guests gather in the great hall. This is where a bard earns his reputation. The feast begins. Warriors sit near the king. Nobles occupy places of honour. Servants move between tables carrying food and drink. Conversations fill the air. Then the hall grows quiet. A bard rises to perform. Suddenly, years of training make perfect sense. The stories are not merely entertainment. They are history lessons, political statements, family records, moral instruction, public memory. A single performance may recount the deeds of ancestors, remind listeners of old alliances, celebrate recent victories, and reinforce a ruler's legitimacy. That is a great deal of responsibility for one person carrying a harp. As you travel farther, you discover another important duty: collecting stories. Bards do not simply preserve knowledge, they gather it. Every region has its own heroes. Every family has its own legends. Every ruler wants his achievements remembered. You listen constantly. An old warrior describes a battle fought decades ago. A noblewoman recalls a famous ancestor. A traveller shares news from a distant kingdom. All of it may become useful later. The best bards develop remarkable networks of information. Long before modern communication, they often served as carriers of news between communities. Naturally, this also means they occasionally become involved in local disputes. One ruler claims his grandfather defeated 3 enemy kings. Another ruler claims it was only one. As a bard, you quickly learn that history becomes surprisingly flexible when pride enters the conversation. Diplomacy becomes as important as memory. A careless remark can offend an entire family. A poorly chosen poem can create lasting enemies. The road teaches lessons that no classroom ever could. And as your reputation grows, so does the expectation surrounding your future. Because before you can call yourself a true bard, one final challenge remains. You must prove your mastery before those qualified to judge it. You must prove your mastery before those qualified to judge it. For years, your teachers have corrected your mistakes, challenged your memory, and pushed you through exercises that often felt impossible. They have watched you struggle through difficult poems, stumble over genealogies, and occasionally question your own sanity. Now comes the moment that determines whether all those years were worth it. The final examination. Unlike a modern test, there is no simple list of questions waiting on a table, no convenient score sheet, no opportunity to guess the answers and hope for the best. The examination is designed to reveal whether you have truly become a bard, and there is nowhere to hide. The gathering itself is intimidating. Senior bards arrive from different regions. Experienced poets, musicians, and scholars take their places. Some have spent decades serving kings and preserving the histories of entire peoples. You have heard stories about many of them. That knowledge does not make them less frightening. If anything, it makes them more so. The examination begins with recitation. A master bard names a subject, a genealogy, a historical event, an ancient tale. Without warning, you must recite the appropriate material from memory. Years of training suddenly feel very real. One mistake might be forgiven. Several mistakes are not. The examiners listen carefully. Their expressions reveal absolutely nothing. This, you discover, is a skill all teachers apparently share. Next comes poetry. You are expected not merely to remember existing works, but to demonstrate your own command of language. Themes are assigned. Verses must be composed. Complex structures and rhythms must be respected. The challenge is immense. Your mind races. Every word matters. Every line is judged. Then comes music and performance. A bard must command a room, not merely possess knowledge. You perform before an audience that includes some of the finest practitioners of the craft. The pressure is extraordinary. Your hands grip the harp. Your voice fills the hall. For a few moments, years of preparation either succeed or fail. There is no middle ground. Hours later, the performances conclude. The waiting begins. In many ways, this is the hardest part. You replay every answer in your mind, every hesitation, every phrase, every note. Perhaps you succeeded. Perhaps you embarrassed yourself in front of half the bardic community. The uncertainty is unbearable. Then the verdict finally arrives. The masters rise and announce their decision. After years of sacrifice, discipline, and endless memorization, you are no longer an apprentice. You are a bard. But earning the title is not the end of the journey. In many ways, it is only the beginning, because now you must spend the rest of your life carrying the memory of a people. You are no longer an apprentice. The years of training are over. The examinations have been passed. The teachers who once corrected every mistake now treat you as a fellow practitioner of the craft. At last, you carry the title of bard. Yet, as you begin your professional life, an unexpected realization emerges. The hardest part was never earning the title. The hardest part is living up to it. Because now people depend on you. Kings depend on you. Families depend on you. Entire communities depend on you. For generations, you have been trained to become something far more valuable than a musician or poet. You have become a keeper of memory. In the Celtic world, memory is power. A king may possess warriors, cattle, and land, but his fame survives only if someone remembers it. A great victory can disappear within a few generations if nobody preserves the story. A noble family can lose its place in society if its ancestry is forgotten. This is where your true work begins.